Well, hello everybody. It's nice to see you here, and it's nice to see lots of faces amongst the people coming in. It was sort of a little daunting, sort of being told, oh, there's going to be people coming in as well, and then thinking, who are they going to be? And now I actually get to look around the room and think, oh, I know lots of these people. So that's really helpful and really encouraging. I thought that I would start with a prayer. Let's pray. This is a prayer by Walter Brueggemann called Retext Us. We confess you to be the text maker, text giver, text worker, and we find ourselves addressed by your making, giving, working. So now we bid you retext us by your Spirit. Retext us away from our shallow loves into your overwhelming gracefulness. Retext us away from our thin angers into your truth-telling freedom. Retext us away from your lean hopes retext us away from our lean hopes into your tidal promises. Give us attentive ears, responsive hearts, receiving hands. Retext us to be your liberated partners in joy and obedience, in risk and gratitude. Retext us by your word become wind. Amen. Now, I don't know about you, but I really hate it when you start a module like this and we start by saying, right, you've got your module handbooks and we're going to talk about that. That is boring. I can't stand it. So I would like you now to start straight off. Grab hold of your Bibles, please, and in your tables, discuss for about the next 10 minutes, what do we learn about leadership from Paul's letter to Philemon. You're level 6 now, folks. It's going to start straight in. What do we learn from Paul's letter to the Philemon about leadership? You've got about 10 minutes and then we'll be sharing as a whole group. Thank you. Okay then, folks, let's come back to as a group. What's going on in this letter? What can you learn about from it for the topic of leadership? Comments? Empowerment. Do you want to amplify that a bit for us, Stuart? Yes, you do, really. You do, honestly.
There's quite a lot there, isn't it? Paul isn't just saying, you do this, I'm telling you to do this. It's that narrative around, I prefer to do nothing without your consent, if you consider me a partner. And then, confidence of your obedience. It's not just, I'm telling you to do this, we're in this together. And the empowerment that actually Paul is willing to take the responsibility, even though Paul is working for Christ.
But the threat is still there.
Sorry, Martin?
The threat is still there, saying, I could tell you to do it, though.
Right, I could, yes.
Well, I'm going to do that, I could. A bit like carrot and stick.
Carrot and stick.
We discussed leadership while under pressure, leading while yourself, you're under pressure. So you're making big decisions. Whilst yourself or your life could be under threat.
Leadership under pressure and threat, making big decisions. Yep.
I mean, one of the most important things that stands out is the language that he uses all the way through. It's really important when you're communicating as a leader that you use the correct language, and that's evident throughout the letter.
Belinda's comment there about the importance of the language that you use. Do you want to give us some examples of what struck you?
I mean, like Stuart, it ties in with what Stuart was saying about empowering partnership. He talks about encourages them. So he tells them how well they're doing, and then he gives them direction as well. And at the very end, you know, I mean, he talks about, I hope to be with you. So he's making, because they're going to feel disheartened, he's in prison, you know, and he's leading from a distance here. So
yes.
All the language is very, very inclusive, very positive, and very direct without being overpowering.
Yes, direct but not overpowering. I like that, and like you say, inclusive.
He takes responsibility.
Sorry, Toby, yes.
He takes responsibility, so if he does anything wrong or anything, charge it to me.
Yes.
Taking that responsibility for the people below him.
So delegated, not abdicated.
Yeah.
So that final comment there just thrown in?
Delegation.
Delegation.
Delegated, but not abdicated. Responsibility.
Delegated, not abdicated. Folks, I think I'm just going to sort of say that is absolutely fantastic. You never know quite what you're going to get when you just sort of throw a group of people into something like that. You know, we just start blank from nowhere. And you have started at the place I was expecting us to finally get to. So, be affirmed. Think highly of yourself. We are doing well. But there's some fascinating things there. I mean, let's get this in perspective. This is the equivalent of you getting a letter from Archbishop John? Sorry, we've probably got to scratch that from the video. I don't want to be on record for but it's the, but do you get? Can we get back into our context? Who is writing the letter? To get back into that feeling of the status of the person writing the letter. It's Paul. Now, either we think of him back in his original context as somebody actually with not that big a status at all, and it's a sheer accident that because he wrote these letters and things which have come down to us, we've put Paul into this perspective. Not convinced. Or we have somebody with huge status, somebody travelling around, founding these churches, establishing these relationships and maintaining them as he writes these letters. He has status. As was pointed out, I could tell you. Paul, you'll remember from his other letters, he's got these issues about the recognition of the status that he holds. This is the equivalent of you getting a letter from Archbishop John that says, well, if you fancy just doing a year in training, that's okay with me, but if you want to do 3 or 4, yeah, we'll do that as well. You know, make your mind up and let me know. I thought I'd drop in for tea, by the way, on Sunday afternoon, if that's okay. I'm round in your parish. Breathe. Yeah? And so somebody with that status holds his leadership so lightly in that sense. And the way that we've picked out these phrases, empowerment, the inclusive language, direct without being overpowering, but still taking responsibility for what's going on. There's a lot happening in this one letter that isn't actually about leadership, is it? The letter was not written so that we might have some convenient, easy to digest lessons about leadership. It's written for a completely different purpose. And Paul is writing to this man Philemon and saying, I'm returning your slave to you. By the way, I quite like it if you sent him back to me, freed and released, so that he can work for me. That'd be really useful. Clever pun there, says Paul. Did you see what I do? But he's not going to impose that, even though you can feel this sense that he's appealing to Philemon and saying that in the new structures of the church, you are still a master, but being a master and an owner of slaves now works differently. That's the purpose of his letter. It's got nothing to do with leadership. But as soon as you watched Paul being a leader, we could see all sorts of things to pull out from this extraordinary man and his extraordinary ministry, and yet how lightly he holds his position. Right, what have I got on here that I need to talk about? What does Paul want Philemon to do? Paul never actually instructs Philemon in what to do. How does he get him to do it? Nudging and hinting. Who is he, Philemon, and how does Paul have authority over him? I don't know. We don't know who Philemon is, but Paul's a Christian minister, and that makes him a leader with authority. So, what is this module? I want to talk a bit more about the Bible and leadership. How many of you didn't actually know much of anything about Paul's letter to Philemon? You can put your hands up if you want, or you don't have to if you don't want to. Yeah, it's not exactly sort of the main go-to letter, is it? And so for some of you, it might well have been, I haven't actually investigated Philemon. I want to suggest that you only know and understand Paul as well as you know the letter to Philemon. Not Romans, not the Corinthian correspondence, not Thessalonians. It's in these little letters where we start to see a real human being dominating the letter. And if you really want to start to feel who is this man, Paul, and how he relates on the big stage as he writes to the Romans, as he writes these difficult letters with the Corinthians, it's also to have this man who wrote Philemon in your mind. You're only going to know Paul as well as you know the letter to Philemon. In some contexts, I have suggested to people that you know your Old Testament as well as you know the book of Leviticus, and you know your New Testament as well as you know the book of Hebrews. So how many of you have not actually, no, do not have to put your hands up, because this is a really embarrassing one, isn't it? How many of you have not actually read the whole Bible? So here is the first lesson of Bible and leadership. The first thing that I want you to be thinking about. Did you really think you can be a Christian leader and not know the whole Bible? When I put it up like that, it's bluntly obvious, isn't it? You know, I don't have to labour this, but you also understand why I'm starting with this point. Because I will admit, okay, I've been here working in this college for 5.5 years, and some of your predecessors have occasionally seemed to... Oh golly, this is on tape again. Can I say this on tape? Yeah, I can say this. Some of your predecessors as students seemed to be proud of how little they know the Bible. And that does my head in. It absolutely does my head in. So let me put this here, let me put it blunt. Did you really think you could be a Christian leader and not know the Bible and the whole Bible? So let me put this as a challenge for you to consider. You've got 8-9 months before you get ordained. You can read the Bible in that time. Oh. There was a little flurry of activities.
I've got a new class.
You've got another year before? Okay. Some of you it's longer.
I'm not in training.
You're not in training, right. You still get the idea. What I want to say is, think about those bits of the Bible you don't know. Think about those books you haven't paid attention to. You need to know stuff like Exodus, Deuteronomy, 1 and 2 Samuel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Romans, 1 Corinthians, James, Hebrew, 1 John. Make sure that in these 9 months, for those of you looking at ordination coming round next Petertide, you need to think about paying some attention and reading the Bible. Then in that year between your licensing as deacon and ordination as priest, read the Bible. It takes about 72 hours if you just sit and read the Bible. Obviously you'd need a bit of sleep in between, but you get the idea. It would take about 72 hours of your life to just sit and read the Bible. Sorry?
It's not a lot open for your life.
It's not, is it, Beverly? It's not. As soon as you put it in that scale, it's sort of, wow, that's a week's retreat. Isn't it? That's a week's retreat. Go, find yourself a retreat house, just sit and read the Bible. And my final comment there, as a youth, Jesus will have memorized Deuteronomy. A classic, typical approach to how you raised young men at that sort of time. He will have memorized Deuteronomy. So, that was my start. What am I going to do in this first session? Because that's where I was meant to start this session, wasn't it? So, we're going to start with by thinking about a runaway slave. Then there's going to be an orientation to the session, an orientation to the module, and the main topic that we're dealing with, method in biblical studies. I'm bored already. I'm not doing that yet. Another one, your starter for 10. Whose leadership do you admire and why? You've got your notebooks there. Just think and write down for me, please. Whose leadership do you admire and why? Please think biblically. Think in the contemporary church, in the historical church, and in the secular world. 4 names at least. Go. And then once you've got those 4 names, please think about this question. Whose leadership do you not admire? And why? Thinking biblically, in the contemporary church, in the historical church, and in the secular world. Have you all got your names? No. Just some examples. It doesn't have to be everybody whose leadership frustrates you, you know. Just 1 or 2 examples will be sufficient. Okay, folks, since I don't actually need these names yet, but in a later session, just hold those names. We will come back to them, right? So, I'll now do a proper introduction to the module of the session and sort of stop messing you around, okay? So, you've had copies of the module handbook distributed. And I want to point out that there are 3 aspects of this module, which is the first introduction, first paragraph on page 2 of your handbook. This module will develop the way you use the Bible. We will extract and investigate biblical perspectives on leadership and use biblical perspectives to evaluate secular models of leadership and see what we learn from them. And then thirdly, we will be exploring what that all means for your ministry in the contemporary church in Wales. So the point is this. In level 6, this is your biblical texts module. So one of the things I want to do is make sure that I've just pushed ahead some of your thinking about how we approach the Bible and how we use the Bible. Okay? So in fact, most of this first session is going to be focused more on that than about leadership. From that, then, the core of this module is sort of looking into the Bible and finding what are the biblical perspectives on leadership that we can see there, that we can then extract. But also, this is not being done, as it were, independently of what's happening in the secular world out there about what makes great leadership and what makes great leaders. We want to look at that to see what we can learn from it, and we want to look at that and assess it from a biblical theological point of view. Do you get that? So we're both learning from the secular world's opinions on what leadership looks like, whilst at the same time coming with a biblical perspective and saying, are you actually saying things that are of value when we're working for Christ in the church? It might work in the boardroom or the school or context like that, but is that actually how we work in the church? And therefore, it's for you to start to think, what does this mean for me and my context and the sort of leadership that I'm involved in within the church in Wales? As some of you have reminded me, not all of you are heading towards ordination. But your presence here and learning means that you are establishing a degree of leadership within the Church of Wales, however that is expressed in whatever office or not you're actually finally appointed to. So that's what this... So we have got 3 huge mammoth tasks that make me feel that, yeah, getting all of this done is going to be hard work. So, anyway, what do I hope you will learn from this module? To give you some feeling of... I wanted to start with that sort of common phrase, all truth is God's truth, but not all of God's truth is in the Bible. All truth is God's truth, but not all of God's truth is in the Bible. I found fascinating insights and observations by moving outside and learning from the secular world in its understanding of psychology, sociology, and things like that. So we start and come to learn from these disciplines. I hope you learn that Christian leaders know the Bible, and that means that they have to read it all the time. If I've started by saying, yeah, read the Bible, it is that we want that to become part of your habit of how you will view what I do in ministry. And whilst I don't have much time to talk about this sort of area, it's to recognise there's a difference between going to morning prayer and hearing the book of Genesis gradually being read out at the front, and sitting with the book of Genesis and reading it for yourself and mulling it over and having the time to think, she did what? Sorry, she really? You need, and somehow those, in most experiences I've had of morning prayer, those moments just sort of blip past without any sort of recognition of the audacity, the shock of God's actions, let alone human beings' actions, but the way God behaves. And if your feeling is, oh, I'll be going to morning prayer, I'll be saying the office in the evening, yes, of course you will. But your interaction with the Bible there is only part of the way that you need to be interacting with the Bible as a Christian minister. You need to know the Bible. It's to get that so deeply established within you that it's just there. And you feel it and you resonate with it, and it informs and shapes how you think about things, how you react to things. Leadership is a skill to learn, not an innate ability. That for me is my final thing. If leadership was simply innate, then why are we bothering having a module about it? Surely we just examine and test you all and work out who are the ones with leadership skills. Oh, we'll take them over and we'll actually enhance their leadership skills. Instead, the starting point of this is that leadership is something that you learn and you can develop at. Some of you will have innate skills in leadership. Some of you will feel, really? No, I don't. Both come and say, what more can I learn? Because leadership is a skill to learn, not something that's innate. Leadership is part of your character. Therefore, any personality type can be a leader. We'll be looking later at personality types and the like, and there's a bottom line thing that says your personality does not stop you or make it especially easy for you to be a leader. All personality types can be leaders. And then my final comment is we need to be thoughtful adopters of the servant model of leadership. I won't be covering servant module today and tomorrow in these initial sessions, but as you look through the work that you'll be doing through the rest of this module, you'll see that there's a big chunk devoted to servant leadership. It's especially distinctive for Christian ministry, yes. But if you are an unthinking adopter of servant ministry, then you might well cause yourself problems in the long run, and the mid-run, and the short run. We need to be thoughtful adopters of the servant model of leadership. So before I move on, you've got your handbook, and let's just skim through and see what's there. So page 3 is my long introduction to what's going on in this module. And we turn over, we get to page 4, and we start going through in the sessions, and you can now start to sort of look through that and start to work out what might be happening as I go through today and tomorrow with you. And that takes us all the way up to the bottom of page 6. Page 7 is where we start the material for the sessions spread through the rest of the term. So on page 8 is session 6, page 9, 7, 7. The midterm teaching session pops up on page 11, etc. You've got all of that. You reach page 14 and you're already thinking this is the longest, biggest module handbook I think I've ever seen, as we now get to the textbooks that you might want to consider consulting and reading and going through that. Oh, page 17, for those of you who like films, there's a list of films you might like to see instead. Much more interesting. So we get to page...
She said Kung Fu Panda.
Kung Fu Panda. I'm told it's a fantastic model of leadership. Yes. So I took the risk. I don't actually know the film. I just found it and thought, okay, it can go down. Right. So it's on page 19 to virtually at the end that we get to the bit that most of you wanted me to start with, and that was, what's the assignment we got to do for this, please? I can't think straight listening to you until I know what the assignment is. So the assignment, you've got 2 parts to the assignment. The first part is a 3,000-word essay, which there at the beginning, critically evaluate ways in which Christian leadership can be informed by different biblical and secular perspectives. And then you'll see some, starting that paragraph, your answer is expected is not part of the actual title. I would have put it in italics, but there you go. But some advice and instructions, and then your answer should include treatment of at least one of the following subjects: servant model of leadership, leadership in collaborative context, Landin's leader styles, insights from popular culture such as TED Talks, Harry Potter, Star Trek, West Wing, Game of Thrones, in issues around gender and leadership. Basically, it's code that says, if something has seemed really interesting from the stuff that we're doing, write me an essay about it, right? And think about it in biblical terms and secular terms and modge those all around and just write me a cracking essay about what you're learning about leadership from it. So hopefully, whatever we're doing in different aspects, you'll be able to look and think, that's me, that's my want, thank you very much, John. I shall enjoy myself, or at least suffer less if I do that than some other titles. And then over the page, your second piece of coursework, critical reflection on experience. in 3,000 words, write a piece of critical reflection, mindful of the guidance below. There were 2 components. Report and reflect upon an incident where you were required to act as a leader. And 2, reflect on the personal implications of the biblical emphasis on gifting and anointing for leadership and what that has on your subsequent understanding of your leadership. Oh, in that... what?
Yeah.
They changed it. Sorry. I will get back to that. I had not intended that second bit should be tied together to the first bit. They were meant to be 2 separate aspects that you should be looking at. The one is, here's a critical event. Think about it, talk about it. What happened in your experience of being a leader? Secondly, with stuff that we'll be doing not this weekend but later on, we'll be looking at the biblical texts on gifting and anointing and try and understand what do those mean for you and your understanding of the idea of text, of gifting. So, since I hadn't seen this between my submission and it appearing in my hand, and now I'm on film talking about this, okay, we will get that clarified, but there's a connection there that I had not intended.
So do you intend that to be 2 separate essays? That sounds...
Effectively, they're 2 separate pieces of writing. We're not sort of saying there must be 1,500 words on one and 1,500 words on the other.
They don't need to be...
They're not intended to be integrated because that puts an artificial problem, I think, on the critical event of leadership that you might want to deal with, because once you start to think about situations where you are watching your training supervisor lose control of the PCC meeting, do you step in and actually help or not? And because it's a critical incident, you're sat there thinking, if in my imaginary scenario, it's the idea that as you sat there in the PCC meeting, you were thinking, do I, the candidate in training, actually step in and try and help, or don't I? And now you know what happened afterwards, and you wish you hadn't, or you wish you had. Critically reflect on that. But the separate thing is to say, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the gift of tongues. He talks about the gift of healings. He talks about gifts of prophecy. Those are not exactly common within the Anglican context, but they're there in the biblical context. We'll get round to that later. But it's inviting you to start to think, what does that mean for me and my ministry and my perception? Not necessarily anything to do with what happened in the PCC meeting that you want to think about, which is why I will get that disconnected later.
Yeah, if you just take off your leadership in that incident and you've got a question,
yes.
knock that bit off.
Yeah. It's possible the external examiner asked for the change. I was told yesterday that the external examiner had requested a small change, but they hadn't got back to me. So it's possible that that's going on. Anyway, that should hopefully be clear enough that you've got a sense of what this is going to be all about. Any quick questions just for further clarification? Nope. Right. Then, checking the time. That's okay. Let's move on to the main topic then for this session, and that is method in biblical studies. Bluntly put, you can't just read the Bible, pick it up and dump it in the modern world. If you try, you will get in a hopeless, horrible mess. You need a solid method. And I want to talk now and introduce you more to the idea of method in how we do our biblical studies. So I'm going to look particularly at 3 little topics. I'm going to look at the idea of self-awareness and communities of interpretation. I'm going to be looking at using the whole Bible. and I'll be saying a few things about biblical commentaries as well. Okay, so 3 topics that we'll be talking about. I think I'm going to sit down. Okay, so as we move and start thinking about self-awareness, I particularly want to introduce you to this word and check that you have all encountered it and know what it's about. Hermeneutics. In a moment, I'm going to put up a technical, correct description of the word hermeneutics. But I find it might help to just sort of have a bit of a colloquial understanding of what the word hermeneutics is about and then get to the technical definitions. So, in this, hermeneutics is involved with thinking what happens before you even pick up the Bible and start to try and interpret it. What are the values and assumptions that you bring to the Bible the moment you start to interpret it? What are the methods that are being used as you try? So it's not what is the actual exegesis of here's this text, what does it mean? We're starting to ask what's going on even before you start actually looking at Philemon and trying to work out what to do with it. Hermeneutics is interested in that part of the process. Okay? So as a technical definition, here we go. Hermeneutics explores how we read, understand and handle texts, especially those written in another time or in a context of life different from our own. Biblical hermeneutics investigates more specifically how we read, understand, apply and respond to biblical texts. You need hermeneutics every time you pick up any text ever and start to consider it. You need to think about your hermeneutics before you can read Jane Austen. Many of us misread Jane Austen because we're not actually thinking about the consequences of taking a book written so long ago in a different society with its different cultures and assumptions. And one of the things that many of us don't spot is that Jane Austen helped create the society that we now take for granted. Because she was living and working in her society and writing against that society and pushing it and trying to get it to see that an income of 10,000 a year should not be the primary reason for choosing a particular man to marry. And so you take something like Pride and Prejudice and its sort of exploration of both Lizzie and Mr. Darcy and the pride that both of them have and the prejudice that both of them have and these assumptions, and she's pushing back and saying to society, these two people should get married if they value one another, if they respect one another, if they love one another. Now in our society that can be so obvious that we do not read Jane Austen aright unless we put ourselves back into her world where one's parents make big decisions like this for us and where criteria such as standing in society and whether, if he's right up here in society and she's right down here, then they can't get married, can they? And Jane Austen says, why? Why? Do you get the idea? And so hermeneutics is to start to ask what we do before we pick up the book of Jane Austen and what assumptions we bring to it. It's about is there a difference when a man reads Pride and Prejudice as opposed to a woman reading Pride and Prejudice? Are you getting the idea of all these things that happen before you actually open up the book and start reading that famous first sentence? Yeah? It is a truth universally acknowledged. Oh. It is a truth. Oh. Hermeneutics is about what happens in the process of how we read, understand, and handle texts. So that's different to exegesis. Exegesis is concerned with actually interpreting the texts, whereas hermeneutics is concerned with the nature of the interpretative process. Oh, golly, Don, that's really clear. Thank you very much for clarifying that for us. Exegesis concludes by saying this passage means such and such. Hermeneutics ends by saying this interpretive process is constituted by the following techniques and pre-understandings. If you know what he's talking about, that does actually make a lot of sense. But it comes down to this. When you do your actual exegesis, you look at the text and you interpret it and you say, this is what I'm seeing there, this is what it's about. Hermeneutics stops and says, yeah, well, you're a man, of course you'd think that. If you'd lived a woman's life, you would not say that. And hermeneutics is involved in that latter process. So let's give you some examples. Hermeneutics, a technique. If a passage describes something miraculous, this is obviously a fabrication, since miraculous things do not occur. Only a pre-scientific society would have believed in the miraculous. So that statement there is an example of a value that people have before they pick up the Bible. They have decided that anything miraculous that they find in it cannot be true, because miraculous things don't happen. Yeah? So as you come and you read a text which describes Jesus healing a man born blind, that can't have actually happened, because people don't get healed of blindness. Therefore, that's a fable, that's a myth, that's a fabrication that's trying to say something. A decision made before you open the Bible about the quality of miraculous texts is affecting the way that you read the actual text in front of you. You look very concerned and worried by this. I am not advocating that, by the way. I'm just giving it to you as an example, because some of you might well have encountered books and scholarly articles that have that value. Right? And hermeneutics says, is that a good value to have? Who says that's the correct value and approach to the Bible? It might be, and it might not be. How do we work out if that's a good approach to bring to the Bible? Hermeneutics is interested in that question. Here's another one. A technique that you will encounter. The Bible is written by human beings, and anything it says about God comes from musings and speculation, not by supernatural revelation from a divine being. That's another value that you will find scholars holding before they ever come to the text. Again, I'm not advocating it, nor at this moment am I trying to evaluate whether it's a good technique or a bad technique. I'm using it purely as an illustration of what hermeneutics is saying and what hermeneutics wants to investigate. Is that a valid technique to utilise? If so, why is it a valid technique? The third one, hermeneutics asks if those are valid decisions. So again, let's shift to another example. There are two texts there on the bottom of the screen. Slightly notorious texts. Let's dig into the problematic stuff. Let's not sort of poo-poo about this, right? There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And the other text, I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man, she is to keep silent. I trust that is a tussle and a problem pair of texts that most of you are familiar with, and certainly some of you are grinning and some of you look absolutely terrified at this moment as to just what's going to happen. Does Galatians 3 control 1 Timothy or vice versa? Now, that's not a real question that I'm asking you to debate at this moment. We don't have time to do that. But I want you to feel the hermeneutics question there. Does one verse control the other? Or does the other verse control that one? Because most of the technical debate going on in the scholarly discussions about the issue of women in leadership focus around that question. Which verse controls the other? And those who believe that women should be silent say that this is the controlling, this controls that one. And if you believe women should be in ministry, then you'll tend to say that that verse takes priority over that verse. Yeah? You recognise what I'm going on about there. But here's the question. Is it correct to say that one Bible passage controls others? Where does it say that one verse is allowed to take priority over a different verse? It's not actually a real question. Some of you will be glad to hear. Here, now, today, it's not a real question. It's only an example question for you to think, oh, good grief, this is scary. Your method in biblical studies starts to impact. Yes? You're feeling the impact of that, of how readily most of us will align ourselves with one of those positions or the other, and we are told, Galatians 3, is the primary text. Women are free to become ministers. And down the road at a different church, they're being solemnly told, no, women must keep silent. That's the primary text. Who says one verse controls the other? How do you work out which one controls? What are the methods you're using in that? Is your method, I am a woman and therefore I align myself with the text which gives women liberty? Is that actually the technique that's going on? I'm a man, so I accept the one that says women should know their place. Because I trust that you can immediately feel that there is no content to either of those positions. Actually, neither has got any real basis. So hermeneutics studies how we find an answer to the question, do we resolve differences within the Bible by saying that one verse has priority over the other? He then asks, if the answer to the first question is yes, what are the principles that tell us which verse to choose? And all that takes place before you look at any specific Bible verses. Now, what I want to tell you is this. I am not aware of a single scholar who has sought answers to those questions. Nobody in the published literature is attempting to answer the question how we work out whether one Bible verse controls another. And yet it's at the core of one of the most fundamental issues causing ripples around various parts of the church. I've personally been grappling with it for 5 years and I've got nowhere. So I've had to come to the conclusion that the idea that one Bible verse controls the other is a non-starter. Both camps are wrong to use that method to try and establish their approach to interpreting the Bible. Now, how many of you did I lose about 3 slides ago, or 5 slides, or 8 slides? How many of you feel you've got a handle on what's going on there? Yeah? You're happy with what I'm talking about? The core thing is not the debate itself. It's not that. It's for you to get hold of this idea that thinking about how we read texts will help you be a better reader and interpreter of texts. because you'll start to be aware of these differences that different people have as they approach things, and you'll be able to read individual scholars or individual preachers' contributions and think, yeah, well, if that's your method for reading the Bible, I'm not surprised you've come out with that interpretation. Sorry?
Like picking up a Dawkins book, you knew where it's going straight away.
You know where it's going straight away. I still remember being in the sermon where we were solemnly assured that when Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, how he really started was, you all know, you heard that story last week about that great guy who helped the guy on the road to Jericho? In other words, that parable could only be a true parable if it actually happened. Jesus could not have invented a story, because if it was a fictional story, then there is no truth in a fictional story. So all of Jesus' parables are about things that he actually saw happen. Yeah? You can hear there, because some of these, they're a little more sort of absurd, and you think, really? Where did you hear that, John? I'll tell you later. But I did. Because that was somebody's principle by which they approached the Bible. If it isn't all true in this sense, then none of it's true. So I have to make all of it true. And I have to do things like make the parable of the Good Samaritan an actual event that happened in history that Jesus happened to have known about. Hermeneutics. You can just about put the word away. You've heard about it, but... So, moving along, part of that, I want us to think about communities of self-awareness. Communities of self-awareness. What do I mean by that? Self-awareness. I want to start with making sure you understand the myth of neutrality in biblical interpretation. So many people present the idea that there is a neutral point of view. It is complete codswallop. In fact, it is worse than codswallop, and because I'm going to be recorded, I'm not going to say all the naughty words that I would have said at this point had I got the freedom to do so, to say how ridiculously dangerous this position and idea is. Because I think you can guess what for most people the neutral position actually is. It's the WASP. It's the white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, middle-class... Unfortunately, at that point, my accent gives me away that I am, of course, an Anglo-Saxon to boot. I know that quite a few of you in the room can at least start by saying, we're not Anglo-Saxons here, you know, John. Lynn Davis put me very straight on that in a beautiful way, and I really appreciated the way he made that distinction. But you still get the idea. We have, through history, there has been this perception that when white, middle-class, educated men talk about the Bible, it's somehow neutral. This is the position to which other positions may be compared. So when women want to do their feminist stuff, it's to be compared to the historical critical methodology of white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, middle-aged, white men. There is no such thing as a neutral interpretation. Everybody comes from their position and their particular bias. So as I start to think about myself, you also have got to start to think about yourselves and understand what is it that you bring to the Bible. You see, it's still part of hermeneutics, actually. I haven't got that far away from hermeneutics at all. What is it you bring to the Bible that starts your position? Are you white, Celtic? Are you Anglican? That affects how you read the Bible. Are you of Catholic or evangelical persuasion? Are you liberal? Are you, no, I'm neutral. Really? You've got to start to identify where you are in this, right? Because each of those attributes puts you in connection with a community of interpreters as well. Yeah? There will be times for some of you where you'll feel that approaching something you will choose and prefer an Anglican perspective. And so I invite you to start to think how you would feel about the idea of reading an ecclesiology from a Methodist perspective or a Baptist perspective. And as you start to think about that, it gives you this sense of, no, actually, you're part of an Anglican community of interpretation. I'm presuming most of you are Anglican. I stand here at this moment sort of very aware of my confused Methodist Pentecostal hodgepodge of stuff. But do you get that idea? So there's a community, I look around the room, we're all white Caucasian. If some of us were people of colour, then that puts you into a different community. Male, female, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Anglican, Anglo-Catholic, Roman Catholic, etc. Each of these puts you into a community, and it starts to shape the way that you approach the text. And it especially starts to shape the question, are you allowed to see an interpretation that does not belong in your community? Do you understand what I mean? Are you allowed to stand up in the pulpit and preach something that, as was said to me when I preached in a Swansea church about a year ago, I can see you're a little more used to a Pentecostal context. Didn't quite have the word darling at the end of it, but I sure heard the word darling. But it was that clear sense of I had pushed and had said stuff that I was being politely told, go back to a Pentecostal church and you can preach it there, but it doesn't belong here. Something like that. You can tell me I was perhaps reading too much into it. Perhaps it was more to do with my style. Though some of you have heard me preach, it's not that different from what I'm doing at the moment, and it's definitely not an obvious stand in a pulpit sort of an approach. Oh, I stepped outside the community's rules of how you do something and what you're allowed to see in the text and what you're allowed to say. Your community starts to shape how you will look at this text and what you will see, because over the years you have only heard that community speaking to you. Again, for each of you can start to think, you know how frequently you've been outside your tradition and heard preaching, how much you've read from those other traditions. So you belong to lots of these different communities, and you're moving and constantly sort of shifting and working out, how do I belong in this? Do I want to belong in this? Am I willing to admit on tape that my position on homosexuality puts me well outside the evangelical church of the evangelical fellowship of the church in Wales's position? It's one thing to say that there's no such thing as a neutral point of view, but it also means we can ask ourselves, should you be ashamed of your point of view? Are we somehow meant to apologise for our point of view? And the answer is no. No. I do not have to apologise much for being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle-class middle-aged man. But because what I'm meant to do is come and say, this is the community and the context that I start from. And when I come to this text, it shapes that background shapes how I see it. And so instead of seeing that I have a position that must put up with prejudice from other positions, instead it's no, this is my position, this is where I start, this is my community of awareness, this is my contribution to the whole rich world of understanding this thing that is the Bible and everything that's God's given to us. And so one is not fighting for position, or unfortunately one often, the minority views end up having to fight for position. That's wrong. They shouldn't have to fight for position. None of us should actually have to feel embarrassed or ashamed of the position that we are in. The better thing is to be coming to this text, coming to our presentations, aware that actually this is how my background, my experiences, all these things have shaped the way that I come to this text. A certain student was talking yesterday about having to preach in a week's time. The text is Mark 10. It's about divorce and remarriage. Your personal experience of divorce and remarriage, either personally, within your family, within your close friends, it shapes the way you come to that text. And we don't apologise for that. Instead, we come and see, because of my position, this is how I must come and what I see in this text. Yeah? So, what are your communities of interpretation? You're male or female, white, Caucasian, person of colour, you're Welsh or English, are you a cradle Christian or a convert? That affects how you look at things. What's your sexual orientation? And then other communities, Anglo-Catholic, liberal, evangelical. Again, that shapes and defines the sort of way you're going to look at things. Are you a lifelong Anglican, or have you transferred your allegiance from a different Christian denomination? How is that impacting? Because you will have brought values and ideas from that other allegiance. Are you Church in Wales but still feel Church of England? Okay. So there's no normal against which other positions are compared. The less experience we have of other positions, the more likely we are to simply view their position as wrong. This is a sad fact of human behaviour, which we've seen witness to endlessly over the previous decades, and I suggest we're just seeing as much happening in certain parts of our politics at the moment. But the ease with which something that comes from a different perspective that does not strike us as right, the ease with which it gets labelled wrong. And that was certainly the fate of a lot of feminist theology for many, many years. And that is the sort of thing that one apologises for. No one should be apologetic for their starting point. Instead, we bring it front and centre. Right, so that's one of the things about method in biblical studies that I wanted to talk about. I'll try and move on to a new one, and that is about context, and particularly to have a little think about Nehemiah in this context, because we're meant to be doing leadership stuff, aren't we? So let's talk a bit about Nehemiah. About a year ago, the readers of a certain diocese invited me to give a talk to the readers to do a study day on Nehemiah and leadership. And again, aware that I am on tape, but my heart sank at that point. Oh, why do we have to keep going back to Nehemiah? For those of you who are dreading too much Nehemiah in this module, this is the Nehemiah bit, okay? We're going to get Nehemiah out of the way in the next 2 or 3 minutes, because for me, he's a real big problem. And as part of that presentation, I did the sort of standard Google search and found, you know, the sort of church which has got big PowerPoints for their preaching. Anybody attended any of those churches? Yes, some of us have at least, yes. And you see this sort of picture, don't you, come up. that sort of, we're doing a study between now and Christmas. We're going to be studying Nehemiah. And there's our big picture. Unleash the leader within you. Sorry. I don't know what I was channeling at that moment, but that was scary, wasn't it?
It's not a British channel.
Unleash the leader within you. And that sort of picture that starts to present this idea and image of who Nehemiah is and what we're meant to sort of see. Here is this big sort of leader up at the front, sort of, and the followers behind. Oh, grief. Oh. Now, the problem is that the difference in context between Nehemiah and us is so huge. It is so massive. And Croft, in his book Ministry in Three Dimensions, I found this quote. The memoirs of Nehemiah, for example, furnished many lessons in leadership style, prayer, research, clear vision, perseverance against opposition, delegation, decisive action. Okay, so if we'd have started off with Nehemiah instead of Philemon, that's the sort of thing we'd have come up with, wouldn't we? Many of these lessons are very much in harmony with secular, can you hear the secular trends in the understanding of leadership and management? However, books and presentations based on Nehemiah rarely emphasize that the governor of Jerusalem is not leading a church attempting to reach a post-Christendom society, but a small city-state in danger of being overwhelmed by its enemies. Surely there must be some differences between the two contexts. Those of you who did introduction to Old Testament in years gone past will remember John talking about context and two horizons and stuff like that. We don't have time to do that. But I really want to emphasize this bit about different contexts. Nehemiah is possibly a really, really bad example of how to be a church leader. He's got a very specific task. And it doesn't translate easily. And and most of the time when you start reading the books that use Nehemiah, when you start actually listening to people talking about it, they're bypassing all of these elements which make it most Nehemiah. And because we're sort of getting these lessons in leadership, we think we're getting the right thing, rather than recognizing, hang on, really? Is that really the way we should be leaders? Not so sure. This was another one of those pictures that I found, which actually I liked a little more. Rebuilding the wall, rebuilding the people. So, matching contexts. Sandals, tea towels and dressing gowns. The standard equipment needed by every mum preparing her children for the nativity play. Yes? Yes. And I put it there as a reminder that they dressed in a very different way to us. And stuff like this, which reminds just how different the context is. It's massively, massively different. Jesus and Paul had peripatetic ministries, moving about ministries. I expect that most of you will have what I'm calling sedentary ministries. Jesus and Paul, what was their ministry about? Doesn't John Wesley have the right to say he had a ministry like Jesus and Paul? How many of you are actually going to have ministries that match Jesus and Paul? Scary, isn't it? As you start to see the different contexts. Was Jesus' ministry about discipleship or evangelism? Was Jesus' ministry discipleship or evangelism? Why does it have to be one or the other? Which was it predominantly, Belinda?
Well, you were just saying earlier about, one person against another. So I don't see why you have to have one against the other, and you have to have one as a dominant. You accept?
I would suggest that reading those texts,
Oh yeah.
yeah, reading those texts, it's not about what should or could, it's about what is there when we read those texts. And to throw up that question about discipleship and evangelism, the desire is to make you think, right? And if Jesus' ministry was a balance or what between disciple and evangelism, what about Paul's? What was Paul's ministry? And therefore, what does that mean about yours? About how you might, what do you learn from this? And just to be clear, I'm not saying you can't learn from Jesus and Paul. What I'm saying is you have to do so in a more carefully considered way. And that most of the time people just grab something that Jesus did and plonk it down in their ministry and say, well, Jesus did it, I can do it. Maybe. Possibly not. Does your context match that found in the biblical text? And if not, what can we do about it? I'm sorry that I am throwing so many questions at you and not giving you the opportunity to sort of fire back at me and properly discuss them. In other sessions, there'll be a lot more time for you to discuss things. At the moment, my main thing is to just open up your awareness to understand that your approach to the Bible, if it's too simple, will produce simplistic results. Right? This is to encourage you to be to an awareness of some of the deeper complexities going on. So the method number 2 that I want you to think about is the whole Bible. Use the whole Bible. Right? You see, the blunt, honest truth is that most of us have a canon within the canon. Right? You understand what I mean by that? Most of us have a canon. We have our favourite texts. We have our go-to texts. And we have those texts that there ain't no way nobody's getting me looking at that one. Thank you. Not even you, Wilkes. And at risk of stereotyping and caricaturing, within the Catholic tradition, there is a tendency to focus primarily on Jesus and the Gospels. And in the Protestant evangelical world, there's a definite tendency to focus on Paul and his letters. And there ain't nobody using the Old Testament. So the first thing is to say, as a part of that awareness of your community has been focusing you towards parts of the Bible that are prioritized over the other. And I can understand those of you who want to say, John, it's the Gospels. And I want to say, what's the purpose of a Gospel? That's a real question. What's the purpose of a Gospel? Sorry?
The person and works of Christ.
The person and work of Christ. Yep, not bad. Sorry?
To spread the good news of Christ.
To spread the good news of Christ.
To raise awareness of what Jesus did.
Yes. John, at the end of his gospel, tells us exactly why he wrote it.
Surely the point is that the Gospels are there to renew God's covenant with his people, which begins in the Old Testament. Yes, it's about Jesus, but Jesus is that covenant.
John tells us exactly why he wrote it.
Sorry.
That's okay. I can't quite knit that into what I want to say, so awkwardly I'm just going to park that one, Jeff. Sorry. John chapter 20 verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. The purpose of a gospel is evangelistic. It is to take people who don't know anything about Jesus and get them to the point where they will acknowledge him as their Lord and their Christ. How many people in your churches still don't know about Jesus and need to be evangelized?
Hopefully none.
Hopefully none. And yet we spend so much of our time focusing on the Gospels, the purpose of which is to evangelize. Again, I'm not, get me right, I'm not trying to undermine what you see. I'm just trying to show you, look, here's this text which tells us its purpose is evangelism. Which again is why I sort of throw up that question about Jesus. It was his ministry, evangelism or discipleship. Oh, excuse me. And we use the gospel texts for discipleship. They were written for evangelism. It intrigues me. So when we ask ourselves, what biblical texts speak about leadership? Well, Philemon's right up there, front and centre, folks. That's Torah. In Torah, you will find instructions to leaders. So you can go to Old Testament Torah. There are narrative descriptions in leaders all over the place. Moses, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings and Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, the Gospels, Acts. Bible's packed full of people doing leadership things. Some of them wonderful, some of them really worrying. Prophets decrying and criticising the actions of leaders. Those wisdom texts that provide instructions on what is good value in leadership. And then the Pauline and pseudo-Pauline texts specifically addressed to leaders. Portions of Corinthians, Galatians, Timothy, Titus. I want you to see there just how much of the Bible we go to and use as we try and get a biblical picture of leadership. Hence my sort of frustration when it's, hey, let's have another session on Nehemiah and leadership. No. Can we talk about some of the other stuff? When we go to one's traditional Anglican approach, I've been a very good Methodist and chosen the Anglican approach. Thank you, Richard Hipker. So we, of course, balance scripture, tradition and reason. At risk of being naughty, let us note that within our three different Anglican traditions, there is a tendency to point towards one of those above the other. And whilst I don't have time to do it, most of us play trumps. The two of Scripture beats the ace of tradition for any evangelical, doesn't it? Yep. The two of Scripture beats the ace of tradition. And for an Anglo-Catholic, the two of tradition beats the ace of... I'm being naughty. I'm stereotyping in order to give you this feeling of, hang on, are there times when we fall foul of that sort of thinking? Because what I want to say to you is this: Anglicans play no trumps. This, for me, is at the heart of what Hooker's trying to get at, and what is at the heart of the Anglican tradition over the centuries, working out how do you hold these different traditions in tension with one another so that they become a fertile way of actually doing theology. And the ease with which we can end up preferring one part or another. As an Anglican, I encourage you to think that you play no trumps as you balance together scripture, tradition and reason. might actually get this done. That's scary. That was area number 2. Area number 3 that I wanted to talk about, commentaries. I thought about bringing some down and then forgot, so oh well, I'll cope. To introduce the idea of commentaries, I want to start with this text from very close to the end of the book of Acts. Just before daybreak, Paul urged, this is on Paul's journey from Jerusalem, his slow journey going to Rome, and of course they go by ship at one point, don't they? And there's a storm, and they get washed up on this island. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food. After he'd basically said, if you want to look at the text, look folks, we'll all perish if we don't actually eat something, so get on and eat something. After he'd said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all. He broke it and began to eat. Is this a reference to the Eucharist? That's going to be a real question that any moment now I'm going to ask you to stick your hands up and commit yourself. I'm going to be kind and allow maybes and abstentions and things like that. Is that a reference to the Eucharist? Yes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6. 6. 6, yes. No. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And maybes? Don't knows? Terrified?
It's a maybe, not a don't know.
Three. It's a maybe.
I'll put the context further.
Yeah.
It's an intriguing question, isn't it? And the thing is, when you go to the commentaries are extremely clear. This is not Eucharistic. This is not Eucharistic. Now, for those of you who opted yes, that might sort of leave you thinking, what? How can it not be Eucharistic? Poor Helen is sat at the back thinking, he meddled with my mind previously, and now he's doing it again.
I'm not coming back.
Yeah, not coming back. I was alerted to this, weirdly, because the military chaplains talk about it a lot. It's one of those passages where sort of soldiers are around the place, and the moment a soldier's on there, then they feel that they could actually use it. Talk about a cannon within a cannon. So incredibly restricted range of text that they deal with. And this is one of them. And it was a student in his dissertation solemnly informed me this was rock solid, obviously Eucharistic. And my gut was, I wonder if that's right. That was my question. I wonder if that's right. So I grabbed down some commentaries, my Acts commentaries. I don't have that many commentaries on the book of Acts. So it didn't take me very long to discover that if my commentary actually talked about this, it told me, no way, this is not Eucharistic. Since I didn't have very many, I went down to the library and found every single commentary we'd got on the book of Acts and discovered I think there's one which suggests there might be a Eucharistic overtone, but it's not an actual Holy Communion Eucharist. But there might be a Eucharistic overtone. It is, of course, this bit especially which gives it that Eucharistic feel, doesn't it? He broke it, and he's giving thanks to God. Okay. Now, that's an illustration to show you a text that probably quite a few of you, even those of you who thought I'm voting no or I'm voting maybe, because if John's asking the question and I think the answer's yes, I bet the answer's actually no. So I know that, one has a reputation and one ends up sort of doing things like this, and it's very difficult to avoid one's reputation. But can you get that? I trust you still got that feeling of suddenly looking at a verse and thinking, what was your gut immediate reaction to the question, and how much you just thought, well, surely it's Eucharistic. How can he actually be implying it's not? And yet, all of the commentaries tell us it's not. And remember that the people writing the commentaries, they're the people who've gone back and found out what Augustine said about the text. They've looked at what Calvin said about the text, about what Luther said about the text, Aquinas. You name your big theologians throughout history, a good commentary writer is consulting them on the text as well. So, what is a commentary and what are they there for? And I want to give you a feeling for the sorts of questions and issues that a commentary is going to address for you. I'm going to say, what are the issues in the ancient world that help illuminate what we're reading here? What are those things that we're just not aware of because we don't live in their context of tea towels and sandals? Sorry. A commentary will ask what Hebrew or Greek word is being used here and what does that mean? When you see words being translated, what is behind it? And one of the things that we'll do later on, I think tomorrow, is to discover how frequently Paul describes himself as a deacon. But you never see it because every single time it gets translated into the word minister. Paul describes himself as a deacon of the gospel. And all you've ever read is minister of the gospel. And you've lost something. So the commentary will remind you, at this point, it's the word deacon. And immediately you can recognise, oh golly, no, that changes things. A commentary, where else is this word used? And how does that help how it's understood here? Okay? A commentary will talk about the doctrines that come out of this verse or passage. How does that actually feed into our understanding of sin, our understanding of whatever doctrine is relevant out of that? A commentary will tell you about that. A good commentary will tell you what are the obvious misunderstandings that people typically fall into when they're looking at this text, and why, although on the surface that text from Acts looks like it could be sacramental language, it's not on this occasion. They'll talk about what other verses can be combined with this one to aid our overall standing of the one verse. So where else do we grab and bring things in? And they'll often tell you how have scholars and the church traditionally understood this passage. Again, as I indicate, it's so easy to feel as if we come to the text brand new. As if we somehow haven't got this 2,000 years of experience and insight and wisdom that we can draw on. Shock horror. So, I think this is the second commandment from John of this module. Use the commentaries every single time you refer to a biblical text. Check a commentary, put it in your bibliography, put a footnote in indicating that you checked the commentaries. Because what I'm encouraging you to discover is that there might well be things that you are confidently seeing in a text and just telling us it's there, and the answer is, no, the scholarly world just doesn't agree with you. Actually, and sometimes that will be because you haven't got a particular part of training, and other times it's to say, no, there are these reasons and they do need to be taken into account, even though that means that some particular communities of understanding are finding their particular approach undermined because of some of the stuff that's there, which is a really, really uncomfortable place to be in. The commentaries are there. So the commentaries are written as specialist texts. They're going to go through every single verse of the particular biblical book, verse by verse, word by word, if necessary, looking at these sorts of things. Most of the information in there will never be of value or relevance to you. But if you're going to actually talk in your essays or your sermons about a particular verse, please check a good commentary. Please. And again, the realism of actually preparing for sermons on Sundays and things like that, I'm not saying sit for 2 hours and pore over the commentaries. I'm saying get your commentary and skim through it quickly, because it won't take you long to spot, ooh, Eucharist, hang on. Oh. Right. Well, would you look at that? My phone says it's 10 to 12 and I've got to a summary. We're doing well. So, hermeneutics. Understanding the methods we use to interpret the Bible and the issues such as what we bring to the text as we start thinking about it. I urge you to use the whole Bible, not just the bits that appear directly relevant. And I hope through our work on Philemon, you saw how easy it was to suddenly realise Paul was giving you a particular lesson in how to be a leader. Very different to Nehemiah's way of being a leader. Using the Bible regardless of our churchmanship within Anglicanism. For some of us, our churchmanship has taught us the Bible first, the Bible last, the Bible everywhere in between. For some of us, yes, the Bible's there, but it doesn't dominate. I encourage you to say it doesn't matter what your churchmanship is. It doesn't matter what your churchmanship is. This is God's word. That's all it comes down to. This is God's word. And please, always draw on the insight of the commentaries.